Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a world of whispers, mysterious pamphlets, and the oddly relaxing idea that somewhere out there, a group of people may know they've mastered the art of becoming invisible. Not in a superhero, zap you out of existence kind of way, but in the slower, quieter, spiritually vaporous sense that only 17th century Europe could dream up. Picture this. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and wet wool. You're walking through the crooked streets of an old German town, maybe Kassel or Strasbourg, though you're not entirely sure because there are no signs. And let's be honest, you're a little lost. Cobbled alleys twist like riddles, and candlelight flickers from upper windows, casting long shadows that move just a little too slowly. Something rustles behind you, but when you turn, nothing, just fog. This is the Europe of plague doctors, religious reformers, and more conspiracy theories than a modern message board. You probably wouldn't survive more than an hour without central heating or vaccines, but tonight, you'll be just fine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already tucked in, post your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing where you all drift off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass a weathered notice board nailed to the side of an inn. Between advertisements for pig auctions and herbal tinctures, something catches your eye: a printed manifesto with strange symbols, elaborate Latin phrases, and a name you've never heard before: the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross. No one knows exactly when the Rosicrucians first appeared. Or rather, no one can agree. What we do know is that sometime in the early 1600s, anonymous pamphlets began circulating across parts of Germany. These weren't your standard angry Protestant tracts or weird recipes for eternal life, though they sometimes bordered on both. They were spiritual declarations, thick with symbolism and promises of hidden knowledge. They hinted at a secret brotherhood dedicated to healing, moral reform, and a very peculiar notion. The members of this society were said to be invisible. Not metaphorically, literally invisible. You'd think a claim like that would raise a few eyebrows, but this was an era when the boundary between science and sorcery was paper thin. People thought magnetism was borderline magic. You could go to jail for drawing too accurate a map. So the idea that a few enlightened souls might have discovered how to vanish at will? Honestly, it wasn't even the strangest theory floating around. The Rosicrucian Manifesto's three key texts, published anonymously between 1614 and 1616, read like the dream journals of someone who spent a little too long reading alchemical treatises in candlelight. The first, Fama Fraternitatis, introduces the mythical founder, Christian Rosenkreutz, who allegedly traveled to the East, learned all the wisdom of Arabia and Egypt, then came back to Europe to found a secret order. Very standard Tuesday behavior. But here's where it gets cozy. The order was supposedly made up of a small circle of learned men, always men. Because of course who worked quietly in society, doing good deeds, offering free healing, and never revealing their identities. They lived modestly, owned no property, and only met in secret once a year in a mysterious underground temple somewhere in Germany. Historians still argue whether the Rosicrucians were a real group, a political satire, or an elaborate literary hoax. Some say it was all part of a Protestant propaganda machine, subtly mocking Catholic mysticism. Others believe it was an early prototype of the many occult fraternities that would follow. And a few, bless them, still insist the Rosicrucians existed, that they still exist, and that they're just really, really good at keeping secrets. You pause in front of a small bookstall tucked into an archway. The bookseller snores gently behind a stack of volumes labeled Alchemy, Sacred Geometry, and How to Read Like a Renaissance Noble. On the counter sits a slim pamphlet tied with twine, Confessio Fraternitatis. Inside, the message is clear. Humankind is due for a spiritual awakening, a reformation, a renewal of the inner eye. You flip through and find a familiar theme. Those who wish to join the brotherhood must do so silently, humbly, and without personal ambition. Which is ironic, considering how many people would soon form loud, boastful, and very public groups claiming to be part of the invisible order. Still, you press onward. Fog curls around your ankles as you wander deeper into this world. It's the kind of fog that smells like wet parchment and something faintly metallic like a key you haven't used in a long time. Maybe a key to something beneath the surface. Or maybe just a metaphor. The Rosicrucians loved metaphors. And in this metaphor-heavy world, invisibility wasn't always literal. It could mean spiritual detachment, humility, or mastery over physical desires. Or it could mean you owned a good cloak and knew how to walk softly. One curious thing, though the texts emphasize secrecy, they're also weirdly public. Fama and Confessio were printed and reprinted, debated in universities, and passed from hand to hand like spiritual samizdat. That's like creating a hidden society and then running a press tour. But hey, marketing's marketing, even in the 1600s. At a candlelit inn down the street, two scholars are arguing over a wine-stained table. One insists the Rosicrucians were spiritual visionaries. The other claims it was all a joke by Lutheran pranksters. Neither can explain the letters appearing in small towns, inviting local alchemists to seek the light or return to the true path. It's like a divine scavenger, hunt, no instructions, no prizes, just a quiet sense of being watched. And then there's you wandering through it all, collecting breadcrumbs of invisible orders, wondering who would go to such lengths just to keep something half secret. But that's the charm, isn't it? The world is full of hidden corners, tucked away symbols, and doorways that only open when you stop looking. The air grows cooler. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, someone plays a lutea sleepy, droning tune that matches your pace. You're not quite sure what time it is, but the church bell just rang twice. Or maybe it was once, twice. Time feels less real here. That's fine. You're not here to keep track. You're here to wander through the cozy maze of early modern Europe, where monks dabbled in chemistry, and every second bookshop had one title banned by the Pope. In this world, invisibility isn't flashy. It's subtle. It's about stepping quietly through history, leaving just enough behind to spark curiosity and lull someone like you gently to sleep. You've wandered long enough to know that things are never quite what they seem in this fog-draped corner of history. Just when you think you've wrapped your head around the idea of a secret society devoted to quiet goodness, the Rosicrucians throw another curveball. Their members are supposed to be invisible, and yet, somehow, they're also out here distributing pamphlets. You duck into the courtyard of a half-timbered house. Vines crawl up the wooden beams like ancient veins, and the ivy smells faintly of old paper and damp stone. On the ground near a barrel, you spot something wedged between two cobbles. It's another pamphlet unsigned, of course, but filled with grand declarations. You unfold it slowly, and the words seem to glow in the firelight spilling from a nearby lantern. "We must remain hidden from the world," it reads. "And yet, it is our duty to distribute these writings, that all men of wisdom may join us." Right. So let's recap. You're part of a highly secret brotherhood. You heal people. You live without pay. You shun fame. And small detail, you hand out flyers about your secret society. It's a paradox only a mystic could love. You start to understand that invisibility here doesn't mean cloaks or potions. It's more of a spiritual practice, a voluntary disappearance from the chaos of the material world. To be invisible is to be untouched by greed, ego, or the noisy squabbles of public life, like a monk who refuses attention, or a cat that simply doesn't care if you're watching. But of course, some people took it literally. There's the delightful story of one 17th-century physician who, after reading the Rosicrucian texts, decided the way to achieve invisibility was through purity of soul and dietary wine distillation. He drank so many alchemical tinctures that he may well have vanished, but only because no one could stand to be in the same room. That same physician, let's call him Johann, because why not, reportedly wandered the countryside in a robe, offering herbal cures and babbling about true light. Some said he glowed faintly. Others said he glared faintly. Most said he probably needed a nap. But he wasn't alone. Across Europe, people began to search for these invisible men. They left coded notes in tree hollows. They knocked on locked doors 3 times. They carried lanterns down into wine cellars, convinced that behind every musty barrel was a hidden temple. Historians still argue whether these seekers were just eccentric loners or if they genuinely believed in the Rosicrucian promise. Some say it was all a metaphor for internal transformation. Others claim that the Rosicrucians were real and simply very, very good at ducking behind curtains. You pass a small chapel. The doors are open, but no one is inside. A breeze moves through the pews, like a whispered secret. Near the altar, a book rests on a stand, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. The third and most bewildering Rosicrucian text, this one reads more like a dream than a doctrine. It follows Brother CRC, the supposed founder on a strange, symbolic journey involving kings, queens, talking birds, and a 7-day spiritual initiation that may or may not involve resurrection. You flip through it slowly. One page describes a banquet where no one eats. Another describes a chamber of mirrors, where all illusions are stripped away. Somewhere in the middle, a mechanical owl debates theology. It's the literary equivalent of sleepwalking through a Renaissance escape room, and yet there's something gentle about it. Something soft in the way these texts invite you not to conquer the world, but to quietly transcend it. Not with power, but with wisdom. The kind of invisibility they offer isn't flashy. It's the invisibility of patience, of humility, of stepping back far enough that the world stops clinging to you. Back outside, you find yourself among others. Not a crowd, just a few scattered figures leaning against barrels, reading by lantern light. One wears a long coat with embroidered stars. Another hums a hymn in a language you don't know. They're not talking, just existing, quietly, invisibly. You notice how still everything feels, as if this moment has dropped out of time, a pocket in history, a breath held between centuries. And yet, for all this mystery, the Rosicrucians were also oddly practical. Their texts encourage education, medicine, science. They believed in the healing arts, not just the spooky kind with potions and chanting, but also anatomy, herbology, and what they called natural philosophy. You get the sense they would have liked libraries, maybe even podcasts. Some fringe accounts say they could walk through walls. Others say they used magnetism to deflect attention. Still others believe they trained themselves to emit no emotional energy like spiritual ninjas, avoiding karmic footprints. These aren't widely accepted ideas, of course, but they make for excellent nighttime pondering. You walk slowly now, footsteps muffled by damp leaves. The moon is high, and a little too large. You remember a passage from one of the texts, "The visible shall become invisible, and the heart shall know itself." There's a calm to that line, a surrender. Maybe invisibility isn't about disappearing from others, but finally appearing to yourself. You lean against an old stone wall, warmed by lantern glow. Somewhere behind you, A cat yawns and then promptly ignores you. Very Rosicrucian of it. You wonder how many secret orders the cat's joined and forgotten. Above, a shutter creaks open. A face peeks down wrinkled, curious, maybe smiling. No words, just a nod. The shutter closes. Maybe they were one of them. Maybe everyone is, in their own way. Everyone carrying around some little secret. A kindness never spoken. A book read in private. A belief held quietly, not because it makes sense, but because it gives life texture. And so you keep walking, feeling lighter now, as if each step leaves behind a little less of the world's noise. You're still visible, of course, but only just. You're starting to get the hang of this wandering through a world where facts blur into symbols, where every lantern-lit alley might hold a mystery, and every bit of Latin scrawled on a tavern wall might secretly mean, turn left at the next fog bank for enlightenment. Tonight's mystery? Invisibility, but with a bit of early science and a generous sprinkle of mysticism. Because for all their spiritual overtones, the Rosicrucians also dabbled quite earnestly in alchemy, optics, and the kind of quasi-scientific theories that sound just credible enough to make you tilt your head and say, huh, maybe. You find yourself in what used to be an alchemist's workshop. It's long since abandoned, and the wooden shelves bow slightly under the weight of dust and time, but you can still see the setup. Blown, glass retorts, copper distillation coils, dried plants strung up like forgotten chandeliers. There's a faint scent of sulfur and rosemary, and a cat has apparently claimed the corner as its bed. This is where theories took shape. One of the most persistent ideas the Rosicrucians flirted with was that invisibility wasn't just a metaphor or a vow of humility. It could be achieved through manipulating light itself. Light, after all, was a sacred substance to them. It was divine, pure, a carrier of truth, so if you could learn how to bend it, refract it, purify it, maybe, just maybe, you could make a person disappear. There's even mention in some fringe Rosicrucian circles of spiritual lasers. Not the pew-pew kind, of course, but beams of concentrated divine energy said to emanate from a purified soul. Historians still argue whether this is a poetic metaphor or just a charming misreading of a translation involving sunbeams and mirrors. You pause at a diagram drawn in fading ink. It's a human figure surrounded by rings of color blue, gold, violet, a kind of energetic anatomy. Alchemical notations pepper the margins. Symbols for mercury, salt, sulfur. Words like calcinatio and sublimatio, terms from the alchemical process of transformation. They weren't just cooking herbs in cauldrons. They were trying to distill the soul. The process, in theory, went like this. Purify the body. Purify the mind. Engage in meditative reflection. Align with celestial rhythms. Once fully harmonized with divine light, the body would become light-like. Not quite transparent, but no longer bound to the dense material plane. You would step through the veil of reality. Not vanish exactly, but become unnoticed, unseen, unbothered. It's a little like that moment in a crowd when you suddenly realize no one's paying attention to you, and instead of feeling excluded, you feel oddly free. That's Rosicrucian invisibility. The art of not being the main character, but the ghostwriter behind the scene. And then there are the stranger accounts. You sit at a rickety desk, flipping through a handwritten journal. It's filled with notes by an obscure mystic brother Gerhardt, let's say, who spent 20 years attempting to replicate the invisibility elixir described in his order's more esoteric rituals. His ingredients? Morning dew, powdered pearls, and a fermented solution of angelica root. He believed that this potion, when consumed at dawn under the new moon, would raise his body's vibrational frequency until it phased out of human perception. Spoiler: it did not. He did, however, write pages upon pages about the sense of calm and weightlessness he experienced afterward. One entry simply reads, "I stood in the sun for 3 hours and felt like a shadow of myself. No one looked at me. I was free." Historians tend to categorize these types as enthusiastic visionaries. Others might say self-medicating introverts. But either way, the Rosicrucian tradition attracted a particular type of person, someone fascinated by what lies just beyond the obvious. Someone willing to spend years chasing the edges of what's possible, even if the only result is a beautifully illuminated manuscript and a very empty pantry. You stand, stretching gently. The room creaks in appreciation. Outside, the night air is thick with mist again. A church bell rings from somewhere far off, muffled by distance and the sleepy fog of centuries. You walk past another notice board, this one with strange geometric drawings pinned to it, triangles within circles, spirals drawn with obsessive care, and one truly excellent sketch of a cube that folds in on itself. Someone has scrawled beneath it in Latin, "He who sees the light sees no shadow." Was it meant to be philosophical? Literal? Maybe both. At this point, you wouldn't be surprised if the Rosicrucians believed the way to invisibility involved walking at just the right angle during sunrise on the solstice, while humming in E minor and wearing gloves made of goat wool. Their writings are full of symbolic riddles. Like alchemists before them, they love to hide their true meanings beneath layers of metaphor, each one more confusing than the last. And yet, amidst the riddles, there's always a sense of quiet striving. These weren't people trying to get rich or gain power. They genuinely wanted to understand the hidden structure of the universe and their own place within it. Take, for example, the idea that you must first dissolve the self before attaining invisibility. Sounds ominous, right? But what they meant was something more tender. Let go of pride. Let go of fear. Let go of the need to be seen. And in doing so, you become invisible not to the divine, but to the traps of the world. It's not so much poof, gone, as it is fade, peacefully, like slipping into a dream where no one demands your name, no one expects a performance, and no one asks for your credentials. Just the quiet hum of being. The slow pulse of light on skin. The exhale of someone who's finally, blessedly, off the grid. You pass a fountain, its trickling water illuminated by moonlight. A plaque on the side reads, "The clearest water does not boast of its depth." Another Rosicrucian favorite. You sit by it for a moment, letting the sound settle your thoughts. The idea of disappearing isn't frightening here. It's inviting, calming, like returning to the place you never knew you left. Maybe that's why the Rosicrucians never stuck around to claim fame. Maybe they really did believe that the ultimate truth was something soft, silent, and unseen. Something that can't be grasped, only glimpsed like a shimmer in the corner of your eye. Or the moment you realize you've been dreaming with your eyes open, and so you let the moment pass, like mist curling around your ankles. You walk on, lighter now, a little less visible, a little more free. You wake up, or maybe you never quite fell asleep, in a quiet town square that smells faintly of burning herbs and ink. The sky above you is still draped in midnight blue, and the stars seem pinned just a little too precisely, like someone took the time to arrange them for tonight's story. You're beginning to notice something strange about this invisible fraternity. They may have been dedicated to secrecy, but they weren't very good at keeping it. You've seen their symbols carved discreetly into door frames, their Latin mottos etched onto fountain stones, and their manifestos left, quite carelessly, in public squares. It's starting to feel like the quietest secret with the loudest whisper. You stroll through an archway, into what appears to be a scholar's salon. Books are stacked like bricks on every surface, and the candlelight flickers gently across the spines. You brush a hand along the edge of a desk and feel the dust of decades, along with a small card neatly printed, heavy paper, the kind that always implies a serious mind. It reads, "Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, Seekers Welcome." Right. So now they have business cards. You can't help but smile. This is how it always seems to go. A small group begins with grand intentions, spiritual goals, and rules against self-promotion. Then, just a few decades later, there's merch. The Rosicrucians weren't immune to this kind of gentle irony. Their original texts, especially Fama Fraternitatis, clearly state that members must remain anonymous, refuse wealth, and avoid all self-glorification. And yet, within a few years of their appearance, Rosicrucian fever had spread through parts of Europe like an especially literate flu. People started forming clubs. Secret societies popped up in universities, often with robes, rituals, and meeting notes that tried really hard to sound mysterious. It became fashionable to leave anonymous letters requesting admission to the order. The problem? There wasn't a known address, or an application process, or, anyone to actually process the applications. But that didn't stop anyone. You pass by a printing house, where presses still creak in the moonlight. Inside, apprentices snore beside stacks of freshly printed broadsheets, some of them claiming new revelations from the Rosicrucians, others arguing that the whole thing was a trap set by Jesuits, or Protestants, or extraterrestrials. Historians still argue whether the Rosicrucian craze was a clever theological prank, a genuine spiritual movement, or a particularly stylish hallucination shared by half of Europe. There's a lovely little anecdote about a scholar in Leipzig who became so obsessed with joining the Rosicrucians that he constructed a hidden chamber beneath his study, stocked it with celestial charts and herbal remedies, and waited daily for a mysterious stranger to knock 3 times. According to his diary, someone did knock. Once. But it turned out to be the milkman, who didn't enjoy being interrogated about the philosopher's stone. Still, the obsession spread. And with it, the paradox deepened. You weren't supposed to talk about the Rosicrucians, and yet people couldn't stop writing about them. Pamphlets sprouted like weeds. Some offered interpretations of the original manifestos. Others claimed to reveal the true secrets of the order secrets that often included how to make gold from tin or how to summon angelic guidance using star charts and chamomile. None of it was peer-reviewed. But then again, neither is your dream journal. You pause at the door of a tavern. Its sign sways gently in the breeze. The 3 Roses. Inside, a few students are half asleep at their table, surrounded by notebooks and empty mugs. On the wall hangs a faded Rosicrucian diagram. A rose superimposed on a cross, framed by 7 stars, and a Latin inscription. Ad rosum per crucem, ad crucem per rosum. To the rose through the cross. To the cross through the rose. It's poetic, vague, comforting. You don't have to know what it means exactly. Just feels like it should mean something. Like a secret you almost remember from a dream. As the 17th century stumbled forward, the Rosicrucian idea began to detach from its original texts. Like mist reshaping itself around tree trunks, it drifted into other forms. Secret societies popped up calling themselves Neo-Rosicrucians, Illuminated Brethren, or in one memorable case, the Invisible College of Celestial Mechanics, no relation to physics or common sense. Many of these groups embraced ritual, symbolic deaths and rebirths, elaborate initiations, and the occasional midnight meditation in a damp cellar. But some were sincere in their goals. They focused on healing, on quiet reflection, and on the kind of spiritual refinement that doesn't require a stage. You think back to the early rule, no one should reveal themselves as a member, They should work silently, heal generously, and never, ever seek recognition. It's almost charming, really. An order with a membership requirement of, don't tell anyone you're a member. And yet, so many people wanted in. It wasn't fame they were, after it was meaning. A sense that behind all the noisy clamor of war, politics, and religious squabbles, there was a quieter world. A world of order, of light, of whispered wisdom passed hand to hand. One pamphlet, printed anonymously in Strasbourg, claimed that the Rosicrucians had no leader, no meeting house, and no schedule. We are everywhere, it said, but nowhere seen. We speak to those who do not ask. We teach those who already know, which is either beautifully profound or a terrible business model. Still, there's a certain warmth to it, a sense that knowledge, true knowledge, should be humble, should travel not by sermon or sword, but by small moments, a conversation in a garden, a gesture in the market, a healing touch offered freely, without praise or expectation. You wander back into the night, feeling the cool air settle into your sleeves. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sings. Or maybe it's a student reciting Latin backwards. Hard to tell. You walk a little slower now, caught between two truths. The Rosicrucians never truly existed, and yet they never truly didn't. Like a melody hummed in the dark, they passed through the cracks of history, not loud, not lasting, but always lingering. And for a secret society, isn't that kind of the dream? You find yourself drifting again, deeper into the folds of a town that may or may not be real, much like the Rosicrucians themselves. The streets are quieter now. Even the wind seems to have grown more thoughtful, nudging you gently through lantern-lit corridors lined with weathered wood and stone. Tonight, you're slipping into the subtle tension that defined this peculiar moment in history. Because as much as the Rosicrucians were whispering about light, truth, and transcendence, they were also treading a very fine line between anonymity and allure. You duck into a small reading room, a place where someone, once upon a time, took great care to organize scrolls and books alphabetically before surrendering to the chaos of enthusiastic readers. A candle flickers on the table beside a teacup that has been empty for a very long time. Across the back wall, one name repeats again and again in different pamphlets, letters, and marginal notes. Christian Rosenkreuz. Yes, that Christian Rosenkreuz, the mythical founder, the man of mystery, the monk who allegedly traveled through the Islamic world, learned all the secrets of the East, and returned to Europe a changed, enlightened man. According to the Fama Fraternitatis, he was born in 1378 and lived for more than 100 years. You know, just casually outliving 3 popes and a minor ice age. Historians still argue whether Rosenkreuz was based on a real person, a composite of mystical archetypes, or just a very literary invention. No birth record, no official tomb, not even a childhood diary. Just a story that starts with an orphan joining a monastery and ends with a cosmic vault sealed beneath the earth, holding not only his perfectly preserved body, but a library of secret knowledge. It sounds suspiciously like the backstory of a fantasy novel, but in the 17th century, it struck a very different chord. People wanted to believe. Europe was crawling out of the Dark Ages, still coughing up the soot of plagues, wars, and religious trauma. And here comes a story wrapped in mysterious Latin, sprinkled with symbolism, out a man who learned the secret wisdom of the ages and left it behind for future generations. Rosenkreuz, the manifesto said, traveled through Arabia, Egypt, and Morocco, collecting knowledge from the most advanced civilizations of the time. He didn't conquer or steal it. He learned. He listened. And then he returned, not to build a kingdom or convert the masses, but to start a tiny, hidden brotherhood dedicated to healing and wisdom. It's hard not to root for the guy. And that vault, The Rosicrucian manifestos describe it in excruciating, oddly calming detail. A seven-sided room, each wall painted with a sacred color, the ceiling adorned with stars and planetary symbols, shelves filled with alchemical tools, secret books, and symbolic trinkets that no one ever quite agrees on. In the center, a coffin, or not a coffin, a transparent crystal case holding the body of Christian Rosenkreuz untouched by time, smiling faintly, as if waiting. Historians being historians have gone slightly gray, debating whether this tomb was ever real. Some suggest it was metaphorical, an allegory for the inner temple of the soul. Others believe it was real, but long destroyed, perhaps under a convent or deep in the Black Forest. There's even a fringe theory that claims it lies beneath the Louvre. Because of course it does. You imagine standing at the entrance to this vault. The heavy iron door gives way to silence and naught. The absence of sound, but the kind of silence that hums. The kind you feel in your chest. The air smells faintly of myrrh and beeswax. You step inside and everything feels weightless, like the space between a breath in and a breath out. It doesn't matter if it's real. It matters that it was dreamed of so clearly. You move to a corner of the reading room where a tiny framed portrait leans on a shelf. It's labeled, Artist's Imagination of Brother CRC. He looks nice. Thoughtful eyes. Big forehead. Possibly German. The kind of guy who'd lend you a candle during a blackout and then quietly quote Plato. But he's not the only figure orbiting this strange tale. The early Rosicrucian texts make subtle, reverent references to unnamed Brother Souther members of the order who carried on the work in secret. Always 7, or sometimes 12. The numbers shift, like dream logic. These Brothers of the Rosy Cross were supposedly scattered throughout Europe, living as physicians, scholars, and artists. Ordinary jobs, extraordinary souls. They healed the sick for free. They carried no money. They owned no land. And once a year, they met in that mysterious underground vault. How they knew when and where to meet. The texts don't say. Rosicrucian GPS, perhaps. Or really good intuition. And then, just as quickly as the movement rose, it disappeared again. The original pamphlets never revealed a membership list. No central headquarters. No royal decree. Just a trail of gentle confusion and hopeful speculation. You find it oddly comforting. Not every story needs an ending. Not every society needs a formal charter. Sometimes it's enough to plant a seed in the collective imagination and let it grow, quietly, in the minds of those who need it. You run your fingers along a dusty globe. Your path tonight has taken you across timelines and legends, but always looping gently around this same idea, a brotherhood that wasn't quite there, but wasn't quite gone. A paradox of purpose. A society that helped from the shadows, taught without speaking, and somehow convinced Europe to spend the better part of a century arguing about whether it ever existed. Even now, the legacy of Christian Rosenkreuz hums faintly in corners of the world, not as a dogma, not as a religion, but as a story that refuses to vanish. Much like the Rosicrucians themselves, you emerge from the reading room into the thick velvet of pre-dawn, quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like holding your breath underwater. The town around you has barely shifted, though the lamps burn lower now, as if even the flames are growing sleepy. But there's a subtle hum in the air, like pages turning in a distant library. You follow it, half dreaming, and step into the moment where things begin to spiral just a little out of control. Because once the Rosicrucian texts were out in the world, once the Fama Fraternitatis and Confessio Fraternitatis had circulated far enough to stir the cauldrons of imagination, the storm truly began. It started with excitement, curiosity, the thrill of discovering something hidden in plain sight. But then came the reactions. Theologians debating in dusty halls, scientists trying to reverse engineer spiritual allegories, and self-declared visionaries, claiming they, too, had met the elusive Rosicrucians, possibly in a wine cellar, possibly in a dream, and at the center of it all, the pamphlets. You find yourself in a print shop now, the floor stained with ink and melted wax. The presses are quiet, but you can still feel the energy. Like a room that has recently hosted a heated argument, stacks of paper lean against the walls, their margins filled with elaborate symbols, eyes in pyramids, roses blooming from crosses, stars nested inside circles. These are the marks of what came to be known as the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, a brief but fascinating intellectual ripple that spread across Europe in the early 1600s. The Fama, first published in 1614 in Kassel, is where it all started. A strange little book, only a few dozen pages long, but packed with enough allegory and esoteric imagery to keep generations of readers up at night. It tells the story of Christian Rosenkreuz's life, his travels through the East, and the founding of the Rosicrucian order. It ends with a bold invitation to those who are of understanding to seek the brotherhood not through fame or fortune, but through humility and inner transformation. The reaction was, let's call it, enthusiastic confusion. Printers scrambled to meet demand. Copies were passed hand to hand, annotated feverishly in the margins. Some readers believed they were receiving a divine calling. Others assumed it was political satire. A few insisted it was a recruitment tool for Protestant revolutionaries or, worse, a trap set by Catholic agents. Historians still argue whether the Fama was a serious spiritual manifesto or a very elaborate prank pulled off by a few bored scholars with access to a printing press. Regardless, it worked. The Confessio Fraternitatis, published a year later, only fueled the fire. It clarified a few ideas from the Fama or tried to. It declared the Rosicrucian project to be a general reformation of the whole wide world, which is both wildly ambitious and not particularly specific. It scolded the corrupt clergy and hailed a future of wisdom, health, and divine harmony. It also restated the original rules: no fame, no riches, no pride, just service. Naturally, everyone tried to join. And then came the weirdest of the three. The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, published in 1616. If the Fama was a calling and the Confessio a declaration, the wedding was a dream, possibly fever-induced, possibly visionary, definitely confusing. It reads like a fairy tale filtered through a dense fog of metaphors, towers of alchemical transformation, rooms of symbolic trials, royal couples merging in cosmic unions. Christian Rosenkreuz is now an old man, invited to a wedding full of magical rituals, talking animals, and mysterious deaths that might also be rebirths. Critics called it nonsensical, others called it genius. Some just nodded politely and changed the subject. You flip through an early edition now, its edges curled like pastry. There's a woodcut of Christians standing at the edge of a strange tower, watching as a golden phoenix bursts from a cauldron. No one really knows what it means, but maybe that's the point. These texts weren't meant to be taken literally, or at least, not only literally. They were riddles meant to be felt, not solved. They invited the reader to see beyond the page, to contemplate, to doubt, and yes, maybe to lose a little sleep. And yet, despite all this ethereal intent, the Rosicrucians somehow became the hot new trend. Secret societies sprouted across Europe, some real, some imagined. Self-proclaimed mystics began publishing their own manifestos, claiming new revelations, new methods for spiritual transmutation. Some were sincere. Others were clearly just trying to ride the wave. You pass by one such flyer tacked to a door. Divine healing via magnetic rose therapy. See Brother Ulrich. Evenings only. A classic. There's something sweet about it, though. The sincerity with which so many sought wisdom, even if they misunderstood the map. They were hungry for something deeper, something gentler than the dogma and fire of the Reformation. The Rosicrucians offered the promise of inner peace, cosmic harmony, and yes, the occasional esoteric diagram featuring planetary alignments in gold leaf. But with fame comes attention. Critics soon emerged. Detractors accused the Rosicrucians of being heretics, or worse, charlatans. Scholars wrote angry rebuttals. One Jesuit famously called them devils in disguise, which feels a bit harsh for a group that encouraged humility, study, and occasional poetic bird metaphors. But this was Europe in the 1600s. Everyone was suspicious of everyone. And perhaps most ironically, all this attention only deepened the Rosicrucians' mystique. The less they revealed, the more people believed. The more confusing their texts, the more meaning people projected onto them. It became a kind of sacred Rorschach, see what you want to see, feel what you need to feel. And so, the invisible order marched forward, not through declarations or decrees, but through speculation, imitation, and soft footsteps across parchment and thought. You step back into the night air. The wind carries with it the faintest whiff of lavender ink and wax sealant. A cat watches you from a windowsill, flicking its tail with mild cosmic indifference. You nod. It does not nod back. The Rosicrucians are still nowhere to be seen, which, in a way, means they're doing exactly what they intended. The air has grown heavier, now not darker, just denser with possibility, as if each breath carries a dozen half-finished thoughts wafting down through the centuries. You walk quietly through the streets, your footsteps softened by the damp stones. There's something in the air tonight, something that feels like everyone is talking about the Rosicrucians, even though no one knows who they are. And that's exactly what happens next in your journey. Europe loses its mind. Just a little. And not for the last time. You duck into a coffee house just opening its shutters, the smell of chicory and old parchment mingling in the air. A few scholars are already here, some in robes, some in ruffled shirts, all of them slightly disheveled. They aren't whispering about the weather or taxes. They're whispering about the invisible fraternity. And just like that, the Rosicrucians go from curious footnote to spiritual wildfire. Following the publication of the Fama, Confessio, and Chemical Wedding, the European intellectual class experiences what could generously be described as a minor collective breakdown. Everywhere you turn, someone is writing a letter to the Rosicrucians, speculating about their location, or trying to interpret a mysterious symbol spotted in a cathedral ceiling that they're pretty sure is shaped like a rose. Pamphlets flood the continent like enthusiastic carrier pigeons. Some claim to have found a Rosicrucian initiation site deep in the Harz Mountains. Others declare that the Brotherhood has infiltrated the courts of Europe, quietly steering kings toward more enlightened policies by leaving cryptic post-it notes under their dinner plates, presumably. You pass a notice board where someone has posted a public letter addressed to the illustrious and hidden brethren of the Rosy Cross. It reads like a hopeful dating profile. I am a student of alchemy, firm of heart, fluent in Latin, desirous of enlightenment. Please advise. He even left a return address. This wasn't uncommon. All over Europe, hopefuls were sending up smoke signals to the Rosicrucians, like shy teenagers writing fan mail to a band that may or may not exist. Some letters were reverent and heartfelt. Others were riddled with symbols, poetic riddles, or poorly disguised ego trips. And the best part? The Rosicrucians never wrote back. Historians still argue whether this radio silence was a deliberate strategy or simply the natural consequence of no one actually being home. Either way, it worked. The silence became part of the legend. The less the Rosicrucians said, the more profound they seemed. In France, scholars debated whether Descartes himself had been inducted. In England, rumors swirled around astrologers and alchemists, with people muttering over their teacups. He seems rather quiet. Suspiciously Rosicrucian, if you ask me. You sit beside a scholar in a velvet coat who is furiously sketching what appears to be a Rosicrucian energy grid of downtown Prague. The man gestures at you with ink-stained fingers and declares, "They are everywhere, you see. They walk among us, and yet we see them not." You nod politely and sip your tea. It tastes faintly of licorice and delusion. In Germany, the situation grows even more poetic. Theologians launch pamphlet war sactual, printed arguments trying to either denounce or decode the Rosicrucian texts. One day, a Lutheran writes a 400-page essay claiming the brotherhood is sent by God. The next, a Jesuit replies with an equally long rebuttal titled, "A Fraternity of Fools." Every week brings new declarations. One pamphlet promises the secrets of eternal youth if you can read the 86-line Latin riddle embedded in the margins. Another, titled "The True Side of the Invisible Men," is mostly drawings of what might be planets or buttons. Amidst this, someone in Amsterdam starts selling Rosicrucian perfumes, claiming that with one dab behind each ear, you'll become spiritually invisible to your enemies. Spoiler: it smells like lavender and hubris. And yet, underneath the chaos, something sincere flickers. All these people scholars, mystics, dreamers aren't chasing fame. They're chasing a promise. The Rosicrucians whispered of a better world, one of wisdom, equality, and quiet service. A world where healing was free, knowledge was shared, and egos were optional. In a time when Europe was still recovering from religious wars, plagues, and existential dread, this message was deeply seductive. It wasn't just a philosophy, it was a balm, a suggestion that behind the noise of politics and theology, there was a quiet garden of understanding if you could just find the gate. Of course, not everyone appreciated the mystery. A particularly grumpy theologian named Andreas Voigt wrote that if the Rosicrucians, quote, truly possessed the secrets of the universe, they should cease their parlor games and submit their findings to the faculty. He may have had a point, but also missed the point entirely. The Rosicrucians weren't trying to win arguments. They weren't trying to be right. They were trying to be good, invisibly good. You pass a poster hastily nailed to a church door. It's titled, "A Warning Against the Phantom Brethren." Beneath it, someone has scribbled in charcoal, "Maybe they're invisible because they don't want to talk to you. Ulrich. Faire." And so, the debate continued. Writers accused the Rosicrucians of promoting dangerous magic. Others claimed they were just Protestants in disguise. Some believed they were angels. A few whispered they might be time travelers. And yet, not a single official Rosicrucian ever came forward to clarify. The silence wasn't just maddening, it was brilliant. By refusing to speak, the Rosicrucians became whatever people needed them to be. A metaphor, a movement, a mirror. You walk now through a quiet square where someone has drawn a rose in chalk. The petals are delicate, the cross tucked gently at the center. It's already fading in the night mist, but that seems fitting. The Rosicrucians may never have existed as an organized group. They may never have held a single meeting. But they existed as a longing, as an idea. And ideas, as you know by now, are hard to kill, especially when they promise something as comforting as hidden goodness in a noisy world. There's a chill in the air now, the kind that seeps in when you're too far from the fire and too deep into the story to turn back. You find yourself walking along the edge of a dark grove. The trees lean in like eavesdroppers, and the ground feels soft, like it's been waiting for someone to notice it. Ahead, something shimmers a faint light, not from the sky, but from beneath the earth. You've arrived at the most peculiar piece of Rosicrucian lore: the vault. The legendary tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, the place that allegedly holds the greatest secrets of the invisible fraternity, hidden away for future generations of seekers. Let's just start by saying that no one agrees where it is, or what it is, or if it is. The Fama Fraternitatis, that first manifesto, describes it in loving, labyrinthine detail. After Rosenkreuz's death at the very mature and mystical age of 106, his small circle of fellow Rosicrucians supposedly sealed his body within an underground chamber built in the shape of a perfect heptagon. 7 sides, 7 lights, 7 symbolic meanings for everything from colors to metals to musical notes. And there it remained, silent, waiting. Until many decades later, one of the brothers, perhaps during some overly enthusiastic basement renovation, accidentally discovered the entrance again. You duck beneath a low arch of mossy stone, ducking past tangled roots and thick silence. This, of course, is not the vault, but it's a vault-like place. You imagine what it might feel like to push open a hidden stone door, the seal cracking softly after a century of quiet. To walk into a chamber untouched by time, lit by a magical lamp that's somehow still burning because of course it is. According to the texts, the vault contained not only Rosenkreuz's undecayed body, lying peacefully in the center, but also mirrors, clocks, celestial globes, and a complete record of the world's knowledge up to that point. Think of it as the Renaissance version of a flash drive, buried beneath a forest and surrounded by alchemical feng shui. On the walls, inscriptions in Latin and Hebrew. On the ceiling, a reproduction of the heavens. And on the floor, an inscription that read, rather casually, "Post 120 years, I shall rise again." Historians still argue whether this was meant literally zombie monk, anyone, or metaphorically, as a reference to the reawakening of knowledge, or even a prophecy about some future spiritual revolution. Either way, people have been speculating about it for 4 centuries now. And yet, no one's ever found the vault. Not really. There are rumors, of course. Always rumors. Some say it lies beneath the cathedral in Mainz. Others point to the ruins of a monastery near Basel. One enthusiastic 19th century explorer claimed to have seen blueprints for it hidden in the Vatican Rite next to a locked cabinet labeled, "Do not open, definitely not mystical secrets." But most agree, it was never meant to be found in a physical sense. You run your hand along the stone. It's cool, slightly damp, and oddly soothing. You imagine it as one of the vault's walls painted with the color blue to represent air, truth, or perhaps the inner clarity of a soul that has stopped trying to prove itself. The Rosicrucian texts often describe spiritual truths in architectural terms. You build your inner temple. You fortify your soul's perimeter. You pass through 7 symbolic rooms, each one representing a stage of purification or awakening. It's hard not to picture the vault as something inward, something meditative, a space of retreat, the still point within the chaos. The place you go when the world's noise is too much and you need to remember who you are. And yet, that didn't stop people from literally digging. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, obsessed seekers scoured hillsides, forests, and abbey ruins across Central Europe. Some brought maps. Others just brought hope. One man in southern Germany claimed to have received a dream instructing him to dig beneath a tree at midnight. He found a jar of pickled eggs and pneumonia. Not exactly enlightenment. And still, the myth persisted. The idea of a hidden chamber beneath the earth, where a perfect, uncorrupted truth waits patiently. It's irresistible. It's every bedtime story, every treasure hunt, every whispered legend rolled into one soothing fantasy. A place where time stops, and all the answers live together peacefully, side by side. Of course, the vault may have been entirely metaphorical from the beginning. Even within the Fama, it's described in a dreamlike tone. The language is rich with allegory. It's never quite clear if the discovery of the tomb is meant to be physical or symbolic. Was it a real space? Or the moment when a seeker's soul found the wisdom of Rosicrucians within themselves? Hard to say. But that's the magic of it. You sit on a flat stone and close your eyes. In the silence, you imagine the vault, not as a room, but as a state of mind, a space within you, where the noise quiets, where your thoughts no longer chase each other in circles, where you feel, if only for a moment, perfectly complete, not flashy, not loud, just quietly whole. Maybe that's what the Rosicrucians were trying to build all along. Not a physical vault, but a mental one. A soul-shaped space to retreat to when the world grew too chaotic. And in that stillness, the wisdom would resonate after 120 years, but whenever you were finally ready to listen, you open your eyes. The grove is still, the air is soft. Somewhere, an owl calls out once and then goes quiet again. You smile because now you understand. The vault doesn't need to be found. It's been here all along. You leave the grove slowly, as if the moss-covered trees might whisper one last secret if you linger just a little longer. But the trail pulls you onward, past the imagined vault and back into the muddled, candle-flickering minds of those who dared to question it. Because for every hopeful seeker dreaming of illuminated vaults and invisible brotherhoods, there was someone usually wearing a very tight collar standing on a soapbox, waving a quill, and demanding, "Where is the evidence?" Welcome to the age of the skeptics. Or, more precisely, the very vocal, literal-minded people who read the Rosicrucian manifestos and had a collective allergic reaction to metaphor. You wander into a dim, paneled hall, part library, part courtroom, part philosophy salon, and find a dozen men seated at an oblong table. There are powdered wigs, pursed lips, and at least 3 monocles. On the table lies a copy of the Fama Fraternitatis, next to a cup of tea trembling from someone's dramatic hand gesture. They claim to heal the sick, one scholar says, but where are the records? Show me a single person who's grown back a tooth. Another sighs, frustrated. Their tomb hasn't been found. Their members haven't been named. Their addresses, all conveniently secret. The room hums with skepticism, not the sharp kind meant to destroy, but the dull, relentless chisel of logic. They demand clarity, proof, a membership directory perhaps, or at least a stamped receipt for one of those alleged free medical treatments. Historians still argue whether this backlash was rooted in genuine concern or professional jealousy. After all, the Rosicrucians were getting attention, even if they didn't ask for it. And nothing upsets a scholar quite like someone earning mysterious reverence while saying, essentially, "I'd rather not comment at this time." You sidle into a corner where a philosopher is rereading The Chemical Wedding with the expression of a man trying to decode a dream written in riddles. Birds speaking in riddles, spiritual alchemy, magical weddings, none of this is reproducible, he mutters. And if it cannot be tested, then what is it? You resist the urge to answer, maybe it's poetry, Ulrich. Literal-mindedness, it seems, has a long and noble tradition. And in the case of the Rosicrucians, it often led to impassioned rebuttals. Pamphlets, accusing them of fraud, entire lectures dedicated to debunking their claims. One Jesuit, clearly out of patience, wrote, "They heal the sick, then let them come to me, I have gout." You step back outside into the night, breathing in the cool air, which feels a little softer without all that scholarly indignation. You understand the critics, of course. The Rosicrucians claimed quite a bit. Invisibility, healing powers, secret knowledge passed down from the ancients. It's a lot to swallow, especially without any formal appearances, published names, or, physical evidence. But here's the thing. The Rosicrucians never asked to be taken literally. Their manifestos are laced with metaphors. Their rituals, if they even had any, are dreamlike, elusive, and poetic. They didn't seek power or prove themselves with miracles. They didn't publish miracle lists or summon lightning bolts. They whispered, they hinted. They promised nothing but quiet transformation. Still, you can't deny there were a few fringe folks who took it too far, like the Parisian physician who believed the Rosicrucians had discovered the secret of complete bodily invisibility. He claimed he could recreate the effect using a reflective cloak made from purified silver thread and sun-charged glass. Spoiler: it did not work. It mostly startled the neighbors and caused a minor fire. Or the Dutch merchant who created a line of Rosicrucian spectacles that, when worn during prayer, were said to reveal angelic signatures on the foreheads of the chosen. They were essentially tinted lenses, but they sold out in under a week. These kinds of stories gave critics plenty of ammunition, and understandably so. But the real Rosicrucian mystery isn't in the details. It's in the discomfort their silence created. In a world that loves labels, titles, and definitions, the Rosicrucians offered only ambiguity. They didn't play by the rules. They didn't argue. They didn't defend themselves. And that perhaps more than any outlandish claim drove people mad. You pass a wall with graffiti etched in Latin. Sapientia clamitat foris. Wisdom cries out in the streets. You smile. The Rosicrucians might have nodded at that. They might have even walked right past the people arguing about them, offered a quiet blessing, and slipped into the crowd completely unseen, of course. Back in the candlelit hall, the skeptics are still talking, still waving their arms, still trying to pin the Rosicrucians down like butterflies under glass. But they never managed to. Because by the time they've finished sharpening their pens, the mystery has already floated down the corridor, turned a corner, and disappeared into the night. You walk slowly, letting the cobblestones press their ancient rhythm into your feet. The critics have had their say, and Fair and New Fairy One deserves a voice. But now it's time to keep moving, because the Rosicrucians didn't wait around to be explained. They just faded deeper into the story. By now, you've probably realized that joining the Rosicrucians wasn't exactly like signing up for a book club. There was no central temple with a velvet rope and a list at the door. No little bell to ring. No welcome packet with a scented candle and a branded bookmark. And yet, people kept trying. You walk now through a narrow passageway that curves like a question mark. Someone's carved stars into the stone tiny ones, barely visible unless you tilt your head just so. There's no sign, no marker, but you feel it. You're entering the murky domain of those who tried to become Rosicrucians, without ever really knowing how. This was the era of the unspoken initiation. The manifestos made it very clear, if frustratingly vague, that to join the Rosicrucian order, you had to be worthy. Not rich, not famous, just ready, spiritually aligned, morally upright, modest, selfless, intellectually curious. Not the kind of checklist you can really submit to HR. And, perhaps most importantly, you had to keep quiet about it. This last rule proved challenging, People began devising their own systems for proving their readiness. Silent contemplation became a popular method. So did giving away one's possessions, healing others, studying astrology, or building labyrinths in their gardens out of hedges and hope. Some attempted to raise their vibrations by sleeping on specific geometric angles. One monk reportedly fasted for 40 days while reciting verses from the Chemical Wedding backward. It did not improve his posture, but it did inspire an entire monastery to take a week off. Historians still argue whether any of these self-initiated candidates were ever contacted by the original group, assuming there was an original group at all. The Rosicrucians weren't answering mail. They weren't knocking on doors. They were, as always, famously unavailable. And yet, some claimed success. One Italian nobleman believed he had received a sign when he saw a white dove land on his windowsill 3 days in a row. Convinced it was a Rosicrucian calling card, he immediately commissioned a symbolic fresco and began dressing exclusively in red and gold robes. His neighbors naturally assumed he had joined a cult or possibly just run out of brown laundry. Then there was the modest schoolteacher from rural Bohemia who wrote very earnestly that he had been accepted into the Invisible Order after spending 2 years translating alchemical texts and tending to the sick without pay. He never received any formal confirmation, but swore he felt a shift within himself, as though the stars had rotated slightly in my favor. The thing is, the Rosicrucians didn't seem to care whether or not you'd gotten the invite. They were an idea, not an institution. They didn't want applications. They wanted transformation. That didn't stop people from trying to reverse engineer the process. You pass a dusty attic where someone once sketched out a map of awakening on a discarded scroll. 7 steps, 7 virtues, 7 symbolic trials, each linked to a planetary force. The first step was silence. The last was surrender. Somewhere in between, unclog the third eye using sacred geometry and herbal infusions. Of course, some seekers took their cues from the manifestos, allegories wandering into the woods at dawn, meditating in graveyards, or attempting to build inner temples through visualization. Others tried to decode symbols from Rosicrucian art, hunting for clues that might unlock the initiation sequence. One enthusiast even attempted to combine numerology with bacon recipes to produce a ciphered message from the vault itself. The result? A delicious breakfast and an unreadable poem. The unspoken rulebook, if you could call it that, was always changing, always contradicting itself. And that may have been the point. You weren't supposed to get in. You were supposed to become the kind of person who no longer needed to get in. You sit beneath a wooden awning where someone has chalked the phrase, "To join the Rosicrucians. Forget the Rosicrucians." Another bit of charming nonsense that somehow makes perfect sense at 2 a.m., because joining the invisible fraternity wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about the robe or the ring or the secret handshake. It was about shifting your inner compass, becoming quiet in a noisy world, seeking wisdom without demanding attention, offering service without asking for thanks. A strange paradox. The more loudly someone declared they were part of the Rosicrucians, the less likely it was true. There's something gently beautiful in that. In a time obsessed with hierarchy and titles, here was a society real or imagined that asked its members to disappear. Not physically, not magically, but spiritually. To blend into the world like a tree in a forest, meaningful and unnoticed. To teach without claiming credit. To heal without signing the prescription. And of course, there were always people who didn't quite get it. You pass a tavern where a self-proclaimed Grand Hierophant of the inner Rosicrucian flame is loudly explaining why he deserves a free meal. He's wearing 3 sashes and speaking in rhymed couplets. The bartender, unimpressed, hands him a bowl of soup and walks away. And somewhere far from that tavern, perhaps, A real Rosicrucian, if such a thing exists, is quietly helping someone across a flooded road, leaving no name, no trace, just a gesture, a kindness, a moment of light. Maybe that's all the initiation ever required. No secret passwords, no grand rituals, just the invisible work of those who show up, gently, in service of something greater. You're wandering again, this time along a gravel path that winds lazily through fields edged with old stones and half-forgotten hedgerows. A light fog curls around your ankles, the kind that always arrives just when a mystery deepens. The stars above are beginning to fade, and a rosy line at the edge of the sky hints that dawn is somewhere, quietly approaching. But not just yet. Tonight still has room for one more detour into the age of spiritual tourism and a phenomenon we might as well call Enlightenment FOMO. Because once the Rosicrucians became a whispered legend and their manifestos circulated like sacred contraband, a new wave of seekers emerged. These weren't quiet monks meditating in candlelight or scholars hunched over Latin texts. These were road trippers. Enlightenment-era adventurers armed with compasses, maps, and possibly some cheese rolls. You pass a small group gathered beneath a tree. They're travelers. Not knights, not pilgrims exactly, but a peculiar blend of dreamers, scientists, and spiritual hobbyists. You overhear snatches of their plans. "We'll start in Nuremberg," one says, "then move east through Moravia, then down to Basel. The symbols are strongest near water." This is what happens when mystery becomes movement. Across 17th and 18th century Europe, people began making actual, physical journeys to find the Rosicrucians. They called them pilgrimages, though not in the traditional religious sense. They were looking for sacred architecture, hidden messages, astral alignments. Some genuinely hoped to stumble upon a Rosicrucian temple. Others just wanted to feel closer, to brush against the invisible hem of the divine. These expeditions often followed patterns. Start in a town mentioned in one of the manifestos, consult a local scholar or mystic, then set off into the countryside looking for geometric land formations, ancient oak groves, or ruins shaped suspiciously like seven-sided stars. Some brought dowsing rods, others brought copies of the Chemical Wedding, which they would read aloud around fires, hoping the right phrase might activate a Rosicrucian beacon. It never did, but the storytelling helped pass the time, and the firelight gave their faces a look of reverent wonder. One particularly famous case involved a trio of students from Heidelberg who spent an entire summer hiking through the Black Forest with compasses, portable telescopes, and a cart full of preserved meats. They claimed to be following a cosmic triangle mapped from Rosicrucian star charts. They didn't find a vault, but they did find a hut full of wild goats and a surprisingly well-preserved Roman road. Still, they returned home with glowing letters and a firm belief that they'd touched the invisible hand. Historians still argue whether these journeys were acts of devotion, early versions of fantasy cosplay, or just the product of really good marketing mixed with cabin fever. Probably a little of all three. You sit beside an old stone marker, worn down until its symbols are almost unreadable. Someone has scratched a rose into its facey knot. A fancy one. Just a simple spiral of lines. Maybe a pilgrim left it. Maybe a farmer. Maybe someone who didn't know what it meant but liked how it looked. That was the thing about these seekers. Many of them didn't really understand the Rosicrucians, but they felt them. The allure wasn't in the theology. It was in the ambience. The promise that truth was out there somewhere waiting in a forest, in a ruined monastery, in a flicker of sunrise on a broken stained glass window. You pass through a village square where someone has erected a Rosicrucian compass rose from stone and iron. It's more art installation than spiritual tool, but the locals still whisper about how it aligns perfectly with the solstice and makes birds fall silent when you stand in its center. You give it a try. The birds do not fall silent, but you do feel very centered. Of course, not everyone was content with quiet journeys and hopeful riddles. In Paris, a man named Antoine claimed to have found a Rosicrucian listening stone in the countryside, a flat piece of quartz that, when pressed to the ear, revealed divine messages. He charged 5 francs per listen. The stone, when tested, turned out to be perfectly normal. But Antoine retired comfortably, and the stone now lives in a museum next to a collection of ceremonial forks. Meanwhile, in Prague, an entire circle of enthusiasts gathered weekly to chart Rosicrucian ley lines across the city. Their maps now resemble something between urban planning diagrams and particularly ambitious crop circles. But for every gimmick and misfire, there were real moments. Gentle ones. Seekers who didn't want riches, power, or immortality. Just a glimpse, a brief brushing up against something bigger than themselves. A feeling that the world, despite its noise, still had corners of mystery worth chasing. And maybe that's what the Rosicrucians offered. Not answers, not power, but permission to wonder. You walk a little farther now, past a stone bridge worn smooth by generations of boots and hooves. Underneath it flows a narrow stream, glittering with dawn's first gold. You kneel and touch the water. It's cool, soft, as if it's carried secrets from 1,000 feet before yours. Someone once wrote that, to find the Rosicrucians, you must become the road. At the time, it sounded like nonsense. But now, with dew on your fingers and stars fading behind you, it makes a strange kind of sense. The search is the initiation. The path is the message. You don't have to find the vault, or the symbols, or the secret handshake. You just have to walk. Softly. With your eyes open. The road leads you now to a quieter, quieter, yet filled with the gentle weight of minds that thought deeply, wrote slowly, and occasionally looked up from their work to wonder if they were the only ones seeing the patterns. You step into a study room of soft candlelight and dust-draped tomes, the kind of space where silence is not just accepted, but cultivated. There's a telescope pointed at the sky and a worn chair beside a cabinet filled with lenses, coins, feathers, and fragments of celestial maps. The smell here is equal parts ink, beeswax, and philosophical tension. Because here's where things get interesting. For all their mystery, the Rosicrucians weren't just the obsession of fringe mystics and wandering herbalists. Their ideas and, perhaps more importantly, the possibility of their ideas managed to sneak into the lives and minds of some of Europe's most brilliant thinkers. Names you've heard. Names carved into the halls of science, poetry, and philosophy. Names that, if you whispered them to a Rosicrucian, might have earned you a knowing smile or a very polite silence. Historians still debate whether these men were actual members of the order, Rosicrucian adjacent, or simply inspired by the same spiritual winds. But there's no denying the resonance. You settle beside a desk, cluttered with quills and parchment. A thick, leather-bound journal lies open, revealing the name Isaac Newton, the man who gave us the laws of motion, who saw apples differently than anyone else, who, if we're being honest, had a secret hobby that didn't involve gravity, but rather alchemy, hidden codes in the Bible, and the search for divine harmony. That's right, Newton, beneath all the calculus, had a deep mystical side. He owned Rosicrucian texts. He wrote extensively about alchemical transmutation, biblical prophecies, and the spiritual structure of the universe. Not the kind of stuff they test you on in physics class. He believed, or at least suspected, that the universe was built on a divine code, something buried not just in nature, but in the sacred geometry of ancient texts and temples. And though he never declared himself a Rosicrucian, He was far too private for that. The echoes of their influence are all over his unpublished manuscripts. You walk to another corner of the room, where a series of sketches hang pinned to a corkboard. There's a face you recognize. Goethe. Yes, that Goethe poet, the statesman, the architect of German Romanticism. He too was fascinated by the esoteric. His writings on color theory, the nature of perception, and the symbolic power of myth are tinted with Rosicrucian hues. Goethe once described the Rosicrucians as a fragrance that remains even after the rose has been plucked. That's either poetic brilliance or someone who spent a little too long in his alchemical garden. Possibly both. Even Descartes, champion of reason and "I think, therefore I am" fame, found himself brushed by the rumor. A few years after the manifestos made their rounds, Descartes left France and traveled to the Netherlands under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered he was fleeing Jesuit scrutiny. Others said he was seeking the Rosicrucians. He denied it, of course. But his writings do occasionally hint at secret knowledge, clear and distinct ideas. Truths that come not just from deduction, but from inner harmony, which is very Rosicrucian of him really, especially if you squint. You can't help but smile. These weren't fringe figures. They were the intellectual titans of their day. And yet they too were drawn toward the shimmer of the invisible, toward the idea that truth might be more than just what we measure, that wisdom might dwell in symbols, in silence, in the space between things. A letter lies on the desk, written in careful script, unsigned. It reads, "To seek the rose is to become the cross. To look too hard is to see nothing. Let the quiet do the work." That's the Rosicrucian spirit in a nutshell, a riddle pretending to be an answer. Or maybe it's the other way around. You glance at the bookshelf. One volume stands out. A slim treatise labeled simply, "On the Harmony of the Spheres." You open it and find diagrams of planetary alignments, musical notations, and poetic fragments describing the soul's movement through levels of illumination. This wasn't just metaphysics, it was art. A blend of science and spirituality. The kind of thinking that doesn't separate the visible from the invisible, but tries to braid them together into something whole. For the Rosicrucians and those they influenced, truth wasn't just about facts. It was about beauty, symmetry, meaning. The idea that the universe doesn't just function, it sings. And if you're very quiet, very still, you might catch the melody. You pull a chair closer to the fire. Outside, the wind moves through trees that have stood through revolutions and renaissances. You wonder how many thinkers sat just like this, staring into the flames, asking themselves whether those elusive brothers of the Rosy Cross ever truly walked among them, or if perhaps they walked with them all along, not as cloaked strangers in alleyways, but as ideas, whispers, footnotes in margins. The comforting thought that behind the veil of ordinary life, something sacred still breathes. And maybe that's enough. By now, you've traced the Rosicrucians from foggy pamphlets and star maps to secret vaults and whispered philosophies. But if you thought the story would stay neatly folded within the dusty corners of old Europe, think again. The Rosicrucians, like all good mysteries, refuse to stay put. You hear a bell chime as you open the door to a new setting. This time, a colonial study lit by morning sun and the soft creak of floorboards. The air smells of tobacco and parchment, and outside, the streets of 18th century Philadelphia are just waking up. Welcome to the new world where the Rosicrucians, like many ideas before them, quietly immigrated and slipped into something more American. You cross the room and notice a stack of books arranged by topic: masonry, natural philosophy, Egyptian architecture, and one curious volume titled On the Brotherhood of the Rose and the Cross. No author listed. just a rose embossed in gold on the cover. Yes, that rose made it across the Atlantic, and it didn't just float here by accident. In fact, many of the same symbols, ideas, and allegories that filled those mysterious European manifestos began surfacing in the young colonies not as obvious Rosicrucian doctrine, but folded neatly into another movement you might have heard of: Freemasonry. Now don't worry, we're not going full conspiracy here. No hidden eye on your dollar bill, no underground lizard conclaves. Just the quiet truth that the American founders, being children of the Enlightenment and avid readers of all things mysterious and symbolic, had more than a passing interest in esoteric traditions. And the Rosicrucians? They were right there in the mix. You pass a wooden table where a dusty tri-cornered hat sits beside a handwritten note. Symbols are not secrets. They are tools for remembering. Very Rosicrucian. Let's start with Benjamin Franklin, man of endless curiosity and suspiciously broad social circles. He was a printer, scientist, diplomat, and, well, let's just say, deeply interested in secret societies. He was known to frequent Masonic lodges in both Philadelphia and Paris. He was also fond of writing under fake names, distributing coded political essays, and speculating about the spiritual dimensions of electricity. Franklin would have fit in just fine at a Rosicrucian tea party. And then there's Thomas Jefferson. He admired Enlightenment science, studied architecture, collected ancient texts, and redesigned Monticello with sacred geometry in mind. One visitor noted that his personal library contained volumes on alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, and Rosicrucian thought. It's unclear how deeply he believed, but he certainly browsed the catalog. Historians still argue whether any of the founders were actual Rosicrucians or whether they simply appreciated the vibes. The truth, as always, is murky. But the symbolism crept in all the same. The Washington Monument, for instance. A towering obelisk, aligned to cardinal directions, constructed with quiet reverence and more than a few Masonic fingerprints. You walk through its shadow now, imagining a whisper from the old world passing into the new. To build without being seen. To guide without being known. And then there are the lodges, Masonic, yes, but often Rosicrucian in spirit. Quiet rooms, velvet curtained, with candles burning low and oaths spoken in metaphor. Initiates speak of symbolic death and rebirth, of climbing ladders of understanding, of entering chambers not unlike that mythical Rosicrucian vault. In 1764, a German mystic named Johannes Kelpius arrived in Pennsylvania, bringing with him a small group of spiritual seekers who believed they were preparing for the Second Coming. They settled along the Wissahickon Creek and lived in huts, studying the stars, practicing silent meditation, and performing mysterious rites. Their leader? A Rosicrucian, according to legend. They were known as the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness. And while their theology was eclectic, their vibe was undeniably Rosicrucian. A quiet life, dedicated to study, service, and the inner path. You sit beside a narrow stream in the woods where they once prayed. The leaves rustle gently, and somewhere, a bird sings a descending phrase that feels like an echo from the old world. You don't know what they believed exactly, but you understand what they longed for. Simplicity, clarity, a world where wisdom didn't shout but hummed, softly, from the trees. Even today, Rosicrucian temples exist in the United States. Some are public, with museums and newsletters and slightly awkward gift shops. Others are private, carrying on the traditions of meditative study, sacred geometry, and inner transformation. You pass one such modern temple now stone, modest, surrounded by rose bushes and wind chimes. There's no welcome sign, but the door is open. Inside, The space is filled with soft gold light, a star painted on the floor. 7 chairs, quietly waiting. On the wall, a simple inscription: Truth is the rose. Humility is the cross. In America, as in Europe, the Rosicrucians remain what they always were: a shimmer, a shadow, a sigh of something greater. Not a religion, not a club, just an idea that people keep inviting into new shapes. They don't need to be named to be noticed. They don't need a headquarters to be found. They just need a place to rest, a room for silence, a heart that listens, and maybe that's all they've ever wanted. The road you're on has grown modern, now faintly paved, lined with lampposts instead of lanterns, and edged by buildings that hum with fluorescent light. But the air still feels the same. There's a softness to it, a quiet presence hanging just behind the noise. It's as if the Rosicrucians never left, only adapted, updated their robes to cardigans, and started accepting PayPal. Because yes, they're still here. Sort of. You walk into a small bookstore, tucked between a juice bar and a tax prep office. It smells like sandalwood, old glue, and a little bit of lavender-scented ambition. The shelves are packed with books titled things like The Hidden Wisdom of Atlantis, Vibrational Healing with Light, and Rosicrucian Teachings for the Aquarian Age. You're officially in the 21st century chapter of the story, where ancient mysteries meet modern branding. Welcome to the world of contemporary Rosicrucian orders. You step into the back room of the shop, where a glass cabinet displays ceremonial regalia, robes, medallions, a wand that may or may not be a repurposed curtain rodand, a pamphlet labeled The Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis, or Amorc for short. You've found one of the most visible modern Rosicrucian organizations. Founded in the early 20th century, Amorc claims a lineage stretching back to the original Rosicrucian manifestos and perhaps beyond. They offer structured lessons monographs, as they call themon, topics ranging from meditation and sacred geometry to Egyptian mysticism and dream interpretation. Their teachings promise personal transformation, inner peace, and access to timeless truths. You leaf through one of the monographs. The language is calm, clear, and a little retro in its optimism. Prepare a space for contemplation. Light a candle. Breathe with intention. You are entering the temple of the self. No secret vaults, no riddles, just structured self-reflection peppered with cosmic vocabulary. Historians still debate whether organizations like Amorc are direct descendants of the original Rosicrucians or simply spiritual homages. But the lineage feels less important than the continuity. The themes are all there. The balance of science and spirit, the pursuit of hidden wisdom, and the deep belief in the invisible work of transformation. You pass a corkboard pinned with flyers. Full moon meditation. Astral projection for beginners. Understanding the esoteric Christ. There's also a sign-up sheet for a Rosicrucian Temple Maintenance Day that offers free tea and a lot of spiritual sweeping. And it's not just Amorc. Other groups, some older, some newer, claim the Rosicrucian heritage too. The Lectorium Rosicrucianum, for example, focuses on inner rebirth through Christic light. The SRIA, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, leans toward a more Masonic interpretation. And then there are the tiny circles. Book clubs, meditation groups, Reddit threads, Andy7 TikTok accounts that remix Rosicrucian ideals into aesthetic philosophy slideshows set to ambient lo-fi beats. You check your phone and find a channel called Rosy Mystic 420, explaining the 7 levels of soul transmutation using a sparkly filter and the background sound of wind chimes. It's somehow both bizarre and faithful. The message persists. The format just evolves. You pause at a window. Outside, a woman in a hoodie is helping an elderly man load groceries into his trunk. There's no sigil, no secret sign, but it feels Rosicrucian. Quiet service. Invisible kindness. Because even in this very digital, very caffeinated age, the core Rosicrucian ideals have endured. Seek truth. Act in humility. Heal when you can. Disappear when you must. And always listen to the silence beneath the surface. You find a table in the corner and flip through a modern Rosicrucian handbook. Chapter titles include The Rosy Path, Awakening the Inner Flame, The Sacred Science of Numbers, and How to Keep Secrets Without Feeling Weird About It. There's a gentle humor in the language, a self-awareness that you suspect the 17th century Brothers of the Rose and Cross would have appreciated. And somewhere, tucked in the margins of a lesson about energy fields, you find a familiar phrase, "We are not seen, and yet we see. We speak not loudly, but we are heard." Still invisible, still whispering. And yet, there's a new kind of visibility in the digital age. Some Rosicrucian groups live stream meditations. Others offer virtual temple tours or host Q&A sessions about symbolism in crop circles. There are podcasts with names like Alchemy for the Anxious Soul and The Secret School Bus. Some are serious, some are silly, some are both. But all of them, consciously or not, carry the same ember, the belief that the world is more than what it appears to be. That behind the rush of emails and traffic and doom scrolling, there's a sacred geometry holding everything together. That anyone anywhere can step quietly into that stream just by listening. You sip a cup of herbal tea that tastes mostly like hope and cardamom. The barista gives you a nod, then goes back to stacking books about the sacred properties of copper. A small bell rings on the counter, and someone new walks in, maybe curious, maybe lost, maybe looking for something they can't quite name. And just like that, the cycle begins again. The Rosicrucians are still here, not in cloaks, but in quietness. Not in manifestos, but in moments. And not always in temples, sometimes just in the space between words, or the pause between thoughts. You've walked far tonight across centuries, through candlelit corridors and ivy-wrapped temples, past dusty libraries and digital forums. Now, the streets are almost empty. The sky is gently pinking at the edges, and the silence around you has shifted. Not empty. Full. Saturated with something you can't quite name, but that's been following you the whole time. This is where the path ends or maybe just circles back. You find yourself on a hillside, overlooking a city slowly stirring. Lights flicker on in windows like stars returning to the sky in reverse. A bird calls softly from the branches above, and for a moment, you let your breathing match the rhythm of the wind in the leaves. This is what the Rosicrucians meant by vanishing into meaning. They were never trying to escape the world. They were trying to learn how to walk through it unseen, not in the superhero sense, but in the spiritual one. Quiet, humble, watchful, detached not from people, but from the noise that drowns out truth. They weren't escapists. They were participants, just not performers. They believed, and perhaps still believe, that you don't have to be noticed to make a difference. That the best kind of wisdom is shared in passing, the way a river gives its coolness without announcing itself. That transformation doesn't require an audience. You sit on the hill, remembering the early vows. To heal without reward, to study without vanity, to serve without recognition, and above all, to keep silent not because there's nothing to say, but because some things speak loudest in stillness. It's no surprise the Rosicrucians were so misunderstood. In a world that equates value with visibility, their quiet was jarring. In an age of declarations and dogmas, their metaphors confused. Even now, people want to know, Were they real? Were they organized? Were they powerful? But those were never the right questions. The better question is, what kind of person were they asking you to become? Not a follower, not a preacher, but a seeker, a servant, a soul that listens more than it speaks. And so they remain less a group than a gravity, less a club than a current. You can't join them because they aren't a place. You simply begin to act like them. And that's how you know you're already walking the path. You rise, your steps soft against the dew-covered earth. A warm breeze brushes your face like a blessing you didn't ask for but always hoped would come. The city is waking. But for now, the world is still yours. Quiet, simple, rose-scented, and cross-marked in ways no one else needs to understand. You've followed the symbols. You've walked through the vault. You've questioned the stories, the scholars, the doubters, and the dreamers. And now, you fade, not into nothing but into enough. You walk slower now. No rush, no destination. Just the rhythm of footsteps matching breath, matching heartbeat, matching the quiet hush of morning slipping over the horizon. You're lighter than when you began, like the world peeled back a few layers and revealed something softer underneath, something older, something kind. Maybe you don't need all the answers. Maybe you never did. The Rosicrucians didn't give people clarity, they gave them curiosity and peace. And the quiet thrill of believing that somewhere in the fog, something luminous waits patiently. Not to be owned, not to be proven, but simply to be experienced. You sit one last time. Close your eyes. Let your mind drift. Feel the weight of your body sink into the earth beneath you. The air moves through your lungs, slow and easy. The thoughts swirl slower now, softer, like rose petals, spinning gently to the ground. You are enough. You've always been enough. The road will still be there tomorrow. The symbols will wait. The mystery will keep breathing. Quietly. Like a sleeping cat in a sunbeam. You don't have to chase it anymore. You just have to rest. So close your eyes. Let go. Let the rose fade into the cross. Let the cross dissolve into breath. And let your breath carry you gently, gently into sleep.